Yeah. Well, this is a conversation more than an interview with my friend and colleague, longtime colleague, Charlie Madigan. We worked together at the Chicago Tribune for many, many years and collaborated on a book and decided that it might be fun to start a blog or a feature that we could both focus on stories that we think are important and get a bit under the news.
Yeah, this is Charlie. I'm listening and talking to Jim. Coming from exactly the same place, we decided that we needed to find some way to get beyond what's presented and maybe do a little of explaining and a little of finger pointing and whatever's necessary to make people realize that there's more to it than meets the eye. And we think that's particularly important coming into a political season where so much hyperbole-fueled nonsense is splashing out all over the place that we think that some more traditional values and eyes will be valuable.
Fine. So I guess the thing would be interesting to do is talk about why we wrote this story this morning.
Oh, sure. Without getting too romantic about it, we need to go recover about a little bit of our history. We've worked together for decades, and at the Chicago Tribune, both in the Washington Bureau and in the Tribune at home, Jim was always my boss, and I was basically the loyal reporter and then later editor. But we covered everything you can imagine. I mean, we did the 9/11 coverage. We've done many presidential campaigns. And also I've done the roadside of that, traveling with candidates and writing stories that way. Then we did a book together. We wrote a book called Dangerous Company, Management Consultants and the Companies They Save and Ruin. And damn, that was a bestseller. It became a business bestseller before you knew it. So that was very good. And we liked working together. And I frankly got very sad about not doing any journalism anymore. And so we talked, and this is what came out of it. This is very early in this process, so there can be lots of changes, but I'm tickled that we've been able to reconnect and talk about it again.
It's
Take
different.
it, Jim.
Yes, it's different. It's different when you're talking to someone. It generates ideas, but it also challenges preconceptions you might have about a story.
Sure.
And when I can remember times when I was actually a reporter and Charlie was an editor, and I would come in and I would talk to Charlie, and by the time we got through, we were writing a totally different story than the one that we were both talking about when we started, simply by that process. And I think that's missing from a lot of news coverage, because now people react so fast, and all they do is react to the news rather than talk about the news and report the news and think about the news. And so when we were talking about this poll, both of us have a belief that, I believe we do, that polling leaves a lot to be desired in the way it's being done today by most media organizations, including the New York Times, which is probably the best one. So
Sure.
We started talking about it, and Charlie was talking about how, I think I'd like to write something about the mechanics of the poll. And I was kind of interested in how the questions were asked and how the editing process worked in polling today. And so what we just did is decided, okay, let's just write something and start working on coming up with ideas about taking a deeper look at the news and not just reacting to the news, but discussing it and enriching it with some dialogue and with some of our own thoughts.
Yeah, my assumption in the process was that there's already enough people just gassing on, and it's, if you follow politics in particular on the internet, no matter where you look, there's always a lot of commentary that's just instantaneous and sort of name calling. And then when you get into partisan viewpoints, it gets, for our money or for my money as a former journalist, even worse. So what we talked about was coming off the news, and the polling story happened to be the one that was right in front of us. And coincidentally, it both attached to our interests, because I can remember when we would craft polls when we were back at the Tribune, and this was a while ago. And we weren't chiseling on pieces of stone, but they were more modern than that. But when we were crafting polls at the Tribune, we would sit around a lot and just read the questions and wonder, is this the right way to ask this? And we had a pollster involved, but everything that he did, we double checked, we followed up on. So it's not like we don't have some depth to this process, but we also know where the little landmines are, and if you look closely enough, you can find them. And we did. So
yeah, and I think at that point, polling was part of the journalistic process, as opposed to today, when journalism seems part of the polling process. And so,
sure,
I think we both agree, but we aren't just talking about writing about polls or the midterm election. We're talking about writing about other portions of the news, because we both read a lot, and
sure.
we both think that there's some really interesting stories going on, and there are elements of these stories that aren't being told. So the idea was that in the one of the great lines I think you could come out of a newsroom was an editor who was reading a story, and they'd say, wait a minute, what about this? And what about that? And so we decided this would be a good feature of a blog, or whatever you call it. And both of us are not as interested in the form it takes as just doing it and getting the thoughts out there in the public realm that, wait a minute, what about this poll? Wait a minute, what about Trump? And wait a minute, what happened in England? Liz Trump.
What about Vladimir Putin? What about Vladimir Putin? What about Ukraine? I mean, the thing that I think the strength that both Jim and I bring to it is we're pretty broadly experienced in national and international news, and because of that, you look at things with a particular kind of skepticism or a particular kind of interest that many people just don't have or can't develop because they don't have the backgrounds. And I find that when we sit down to talk about something, it's really enlivening for me to have somebody who speaks my language and I speak his language too. And then you just translate it into language that other people speak, and it can work pretty well, I think. And
so it's very, one of the most difficult things in the world really is to write a book. And it's even more difficult when you're trying to collaborate with someone on writing a book. You don't always agree on everything like that, on everything that you're writing about. But Charlie and I worked very well together on Dangerous Company, and put together, like you said, a best-selling book. So we found that there's a synergy. I hate to use the word synergy because that's what they used to use at Tribune all the time.
Exactly. Yes.
But there was a commonality of interest and a commonality of curiosity, and also a way we could both agree on a lot of the common themes that we wanted to approach. And so that collaboration led us to think that maybe we should do it again, but in a different format, for a different audience and at a different time.
Mm-hmm. I think that, what works for us, I have never been reluctant to take constructive criticism from Jim, and I think he's in the same boat with me. I really respect what he's done, and Jim knows how to work with someone, and I think over time I proved that I do too, and that's why the whole relationship functions so well, because he's not afraid to call it out if he sees it. He's not afraid to say that's a bad idea, and I'm not afraid to hear it, which is another part of the process. So I think that part works pretty well. And in this little example in the polling story, we happen to be in lockstep on it. I'm sure there'll be stories where we're not, and I would hope that people who read them would be able to see that and understand that there are different perspectives at work in whatever they're reading.
Right. All right. Our collaboration on this story isn't the last one we're going to do. We're already thinking about another story, censorship, how it plays out in Moscow, where Charlie used to be a foreign correspondent, and how it plays out in China, a country that I visited several times, that never worked and lived there. But it's just a fascinating story, and in almost every place I've ever been, and every story I've ever covered, where the government took over something, the first thing they did is they seized the press. And I think you've seen that playing out so well in the story we're going to write about next.
Yeah, I exactly the same sentiment on my part, except that I believe that information and news is like mercury, and it finds its way to run through all sorts of interesting things that the government can't block. So, you know, it's always was surprising me when I lived in the Soviet Union, the old Soviet Union, that you could always find access to Voice of America, the BBC, any number of other places where you could pick up news, even though the government tried to ban it and tried to block the broadcasts. So there'll be some tastes of that, I think, on what we're doing.